Brazil, it's not a party without meat. And beef is king.
It's crazy here.
The world is eating more beef than ever, and Brazil is a good place to understand why. The country eats a lot of cows, raises a lot of cows, and feeds a lot of cows. It's a multi-billion-dollar business that's enriched the country's economy and filled a lot of bellies, but at a giant environmental price tag. If Brazil's beef industry were a country, it'd be the world's 7th biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. I went to the heart of Brazil's cattle country to see what our global dependency on beef is costing us, and why it's so hard to quit. We're addicted to the things we know are bad for the planet. So why is it so hard to kick them? Marcio Prado hauls grain for a living. He has about 2,500 kilometers to cover in the next 72 hours, and he's running a bit late this morning.
Ontem ainda foi aniversário de uma das filhas, né? Criança, assim, né? Nós só comemorou assim, salgadinhos. Mas quando é dos mais velhos, nós assim, nós costumamos só uma carne. Aí nós não quer nem bolo.
We're traveling on the BR-163, a highway that cuts through the Brazilian Amazon. Every day, hundreds of trucks set off from major settlements like Sinop in the state of Mato Grosso, headed towards port cities in northern Brazil, and from there, worldwide. Places like Sinop didn't exist until the early 1970s, when government policy encouraged Brazilians from densely populated areas in the country's south to settle here and colonize the Amazon region. That's when cattle ranching took off. Today, Mato Grosso is the cattle mecca of Brazil. It has the largest herd in the country and also produces the most soy and corn, which feed livestock here and around the world. With global beef production nearly tripling between 1960 and 2021, there are never enough drivers to go around here.
Estragou na estrada e nós teve que dar o jeito brasileiro. Filho, a gente tem que escolher, né? Ou a família ou o serviço, porque não dá pros dois, né? Estar nessa vida aí sempre trabalhando aí.
Cattle drivers spend days away from family, sleeping in their trucks at night, and earning about $80 per trip.
10, 15 quilômetros, a gente tem que parar o caminhão, olhar o gado, tem que estar tudo de pé. A passagem do gado é paga para eles andar de pé. É bem sofrido, bem cansativo.
Se eu tivesse a oportunidade de ganhar o dinheiro em outro tipo de serviço, eu estaria trabalhando nesse exato momento.
As you drive north on the BR-163, you can see the evolution of a booming cattle industry play out. There's the most recent giant field of soy and corn, which were likely once cattle pasture, and further along, there's cattle pasture, which used to be the rainforest. Finally, the highway crosses into the state of Pará, which is still mostly rainforest, but has seen the highest rates of deforestation in Brazil in the last decade. Most of it is thought to be illegal. Firefighters like Wanderlei de Oliveira Silva are on the front lines of this. He works for the country's Ministry of Environment, and his team has spent the last month camping out in a protected forest area off the highway in Pará called the Nascentes da Serra do Cachimbo. When you think of the Amazon rainforest, you probably think of this, but it looks increasingly like this and this. In the last 3 decades, the Brazilian Amazon has lost nearly 1 million square kilometers of forest land. Deforestation often begins with settlers cutting and burning down forested area, bringing cattle in to occupy that land, then negotiating for that land to become legal property.
O fogo vai entrando e vai matando também um bocado da vegetação. A pessoa sabe que não vai ser punido, não vai ser penalizado por aquele ato que ele fez, aí ele vai continuar fazendo.
This process has wreaked havoc on local wildlife and displaced indigenous peoples. It's also played a significant role in climate change. Deforestation means less trees to absorb carbon dioxide, and when trees are burned, CO2 that had been sequestered is released back into the atmosphere. Fewer trees also means less water evaporation, a natural cooling effect, without which the Earth would warm up by several degrees. This has put a lot of pressure on the government.
Não precisamos derrubar uma única árvore para plantar cana-de-açúcar ou para criar gado.
Amongst other protective initiatives, the government made deals with meat packers in the late 2000s in which they agreed to only purchase from farms that have been certified as deforestation-free. When we visited this meat processing plant just outside Sinop, auditors were there to make sure that no cows are sourced from the Amazon region. If Rialto can do that, then the slaughterhouse will be allowed to sell their beef to McDonald's. But knowing where their cattle come from isn't easy. Even government intervention hasn't been entirely effective at curbing the problem.
O desafio sempre foi isso. Lidar com essa cultura de fazer o produtor entender que em algum momento talvez vai ser melhor ele deixar de abrir uma nova área e intensificar a produção na área que ele já tem aberto.
Take the Nascentes da Serra do Cachimbo. It's an area protected by federal decree in 2005. Things like logging and cattle ranching are banned here, and even visits need prior approval. But because of its proximity to the BR-163, it's one of the most threatened parts of the Amazon rainforest. In just a few hours of driving around, we saw bridges intentionally destroyed to stop authorities from doing their inspections, and a number of farms and cattle.
At least 80% of the deforested area becomes pasture within about 5 years.
To get away from legal oversight, ranchers raise cows in illegal pastures, then transfer them to legal farms just before slaughter. Sometimes they falsify papers on their origin. It's called cattle laundering. In this way, cows become really hard to trace. Data shows that last year, 25,000 head of cattle were sold from 92 illegal farms operating in the Nascentes da Serra do Cachimbo.
Any slaughterhouse in north central Mato Grosso or in western Pará along that same highway would certainly be at risk of having purchased these cattle if they weren't doing robust checks on their entire supply chain.
One potential solution is to put GPS trackers on cows from the moment they're born so that every cow is accounted for, though it's unclear how widely this can be implemented or who will foot the bill. It also doesn't change the other climate problem with cows. Their digestive system produces methane, a type of greenhouse gas that's about 80 times worse than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere over a 20-year period. Some researchers have tried giving cows a diet of seaweed or alternative feeds to decrease their methane emissions, and it's shown promising results. But critics say seaweed feeding comes in too late at the end of a cow's life to make a noticeable impact, and changing the supply chain system of producing cattle feed is a big project.
I can go on the record as saying there's absolutely no way this will scale to anything remotely near the total global cow population.
The most effective way to reduce the carbon footprint of cows might just be to eat less of them.
Oh, look, even my dog snacks are vegan. I don't know how to say fibra in English.
Fiber.
Fiber, it makes sense. No Brasil, é uma coisa que a gente aprende que um prato só tá completo com a proteína animal. E quando você tira essa proteína animal, é como se faltasse alguma coisa. Quando eu parei de comer carne, eu sentia muito isso. Eu vi o meu prato e falava, tem alguma coisa faltando.
Eu sou vegetariana há cerca de 11, 12 anos. Meu pai ainda sempre falando, você não vai comer uma carne hoje? Você não quer comer, você tá tão magrinha.
Valentina, Gisele, and Marcos are part of a small but growing movement to go meatless for health and environmental reasons. But the main factor behind drops in beef consumption is usually the price. You can see this in the UK, and even recently in Brazil, where food prices skyrocketed and beef consumption dropped to its lowest since the 1990s, according to government data. Although you wouldn't know it inside Moceyin, a classic Brazilian barbecue joint. This place was absolutely packed on a recent public holiday.
Eu gosto muito de carne, mas eu já pensei em diminuir a quantidade. Eu acho muito radical só cortar a carne assim, para mim seria muito difícil.
To meaningfully shift meat consumption patterns, experts say that it would require a combination of interventions.
People don't necessarily care whether or not they're pumping gas into their car or whether they're plugging their car into the wall as long as their car drives. Whereas with meat, unlike with coal or unlike with oil, consumers actually make purchasing decisions 3 times a day or more. So people are actually voting with their dollars.
Think of it as a series of progressively more active steps, otherwise known as the Nuffield ladder. Let me explain. The first step is information, such as spreading awareness of beef's impact on the climate through media. Then there's changing what's called the choice architecture. In a place like Brazil, for example, beef dishes are the default option on a menu, from all-you-can-eat buffets to schools.
Muitas vezes nós vamos assim no restaurante, aí fala assim, mas eu não como carne. Mas tem frango, mas tem peixe.
Changing that would mean making vegetarian options much more prominent, like this vegan restaurant in Rio de Janeiro. Finally, at the top, there's active governmental measures, like when a city in the Netherlands banned meat advertisements in public spaces. But that's not likely to happen anytime soon in Brazil. The politics of meat is complicated. Remember earlier how I explained that soy and corn grow alongside cattle pasture on the BR-163? All this corn right here in the middle of the rainforest, it goes to cows, and not just the ones here in Brazil. The majority is exported to China, where it's turned into livestock feed for the country's pork industry, and where beef demand is growing. China spent around $28 billion importing Brazilian soy and corn in 2022. To boost trade, China has also invested more than $70 billion in Brazil's infrastructure, including ports and railways. For example, Chinese companies have expressed interest in building the Ferrogrão, literally a grain train that would run parallel to the BR-163. This could make shipments cheaper and quicker, but at a cost of further deforestation and displacing indigenous communities who live in the Amazon.
This demand policy is much more important than internal regulations in Brazil.
In order to keep its exports competitive and the agricultural economy running, Brazil's government spends billions subsidizing its cattle and soy farms, which, in turn, has fueled a powerful political force in Brazil known as the Bancada Ruralista, or Rural Caucus.
They are very powerful. Ruralists have almost half of the congressmen. They can name judges. They can name federal policy.
Even as Brazilian President Lula came back into power in 2022 with promises to protect the rainforest, he's had to appease powerful agribusiness interests, as well as everyday voters who are concerned with the price of beef.
Nós vamos voltar a reunir a família no domingo e nós vamos fazer churrasquinho.
It's not just Brazil treading this balance. The world's top beef producers have built an ecosystem of policies and subsidies for beef, even as they look to fulfill climate pledges. One of them is the European Union, which in 2018 gave more than 8 billion euros in direct subsidies to cattle farms. Without this support, beef farmers across the continent would be operating at losses. And where does the EU import its livestock feed from? The cattle mecca of Brazil. In many ways, how the country manages environmental protection and economic development is influenced thousands of kilometers away by policymakers in Brussels or diners in Shanghai.
A gente fica triste com o desmatamento porque a gente sabe que a gente está prejudicando nossa geração próxima, né? Mas a gente também precisa trabalhar, precisa sobreviver, precisa comer. Se não tivesse o desmatamento hoje, se não tivesse uma fazenda cheia de gado, a gente não estaria trabalhando.
Far away from the Amazon, throughout the streets of Rio de Janeiro, the politics and economics that shape our beef habit fade away, and something else takes over. The final piece of the puzzle for why beef is hard to quit.
Sinto falta, às vezes, do churrasco. Não é nem pelo paladar. Eu acho que é muito mais por toda essa atmosfera. O cheiro tem uma relação muito afetiva, né? Encontros de família, encontros de amigos.
Until a close enough version comes along, beef's beloved taste, its association with family and culture, its status as a sign of prosperity, holds sway in so many of us.
In 3 days, I'm 21.
Are you coming back here in 3 days?
No. We're going to make a barbecue. Family one.
Meus pais estão comemorando 60 anos de matrimônio. O âmago do meu pai é muito importante e ele resolveu por conta disso, que é proporcionar um momento saboroso e familiar com a carne, entendeu? Poderia ser numa pizzeria, mas não é a mesma coisa, entendeu?
Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. And check out this video that we did about coal.